we thought it'd be good. We've been talking at you for most of the afternoon. We talked about observability strategy. We talked about our platform. Brian bared his heart and soul for us in terms of his entire career. He basically laid out the 6 stages of observability, and that he's done all of them personally. So it was great to hear that. And then listening to Laban, thank you, Laban, for sharing your experiences and your perspective, and then having Matt go through business values. So going through this, doing a panel and sort of talking through and having a conversation, I think is a nice way to end the day, and you hear from different perspectives and points of views. So, you know me, Ricardo Lupo, Solution Engineering Director. What I didn't tell you before, and I should have told you, I spent most of my entire career doing this. First half of my career on the customer side, working for large financial services organizations. I'm from New York, you could tell from the accent, Merrill Lynch, Credit Suisse, and then the other half working for software companies. So I've sort of seen this journey progress from the data center to cloud to modern tooling. But getting some different perspectives, so getting both of you up here and talking through your experience. So Dave, first, maybe introduction, name, role, company, what you do, and one thing we don't know about you that we could learn today.
Yeah, sure. So hello, everyone. My name is David Frankel. I'm a principal software engineer at CarGurus. Been at the company for a few years now. I've done many roles over the years. So did data engineering for a while, did more traditional backend development. So I've been kind of all over. But right now on the SRE team, and we work on reliability and observability.
And what's one favorite fact about yourself?
Fact. Yeah. Well, not necessarily a favorite fact, but kind of a random fact, maybe is a better way to put it. I actually used to work in a genetics wet lab. So I started off in biology, not in comp sci, as you'd probably expect. So it was kind of an interesting experience going from that into, the software engineering space.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Szodfridt. I'm a senior solutions principal at Nearform. My career is spans 25 plus years, way too long than I care to admit sometimes in IT. I first started writing software for industrial control systems, making machines run, which still, that was a really long time ago, but today that's still one of the coolest things in my career is making these mechanical things not slam into each other. Did a long stint building agile practices, helping companies develop software in very efficient, productive ways, mainly on the software side. And then I was one of the founding members at, everyone knows a company called Pivotal. I was part of Pivotal, the application transformation practice, where we took giant monoliths, made them all microservices and clouds, and moved them to the cloud. So I've been around for a long time, seen lots of things, many industry verticals, mainly been on the software side. But as you're running software, the observability is always there as well, because it's all kind of related. An interesting thing about me, I don't know if my name's still up there, but my name has 9 letters, 7 consonants, and 2 vowels. So it's pretty messed up, and there's a Z in there, which no one knows what to do with, right? So see, everybody's laughing. Okay, so it is there. So the name it has Swedish origins. My grandfather did our family tree back actually 400 years. And when the Swedes came to Hungary, they threw in a bunch of extra letters. So it's pronounced phonetically as it would be in Swedish. The interesting thing about that is there's in North, South, and Central America, there's 3 people with that name. And anyone else who has that name in the world is in Europe, and they're all related to me. So I could never be a spy with that name.
Very interesting. Also, probably a great final question on Wheel of Fortune. Nobody would ever get.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So let's get right into it. So David, I'll start with you. Talk about business goals. We talk about business being really the most important part of the observability journey, right? Really getting aligned there. Why is observability so important to your business, and why is it so important to your users?
Yeah, sure. So, we can talk about more, the MTTx type of metrics, right? So I won't go too deep into that, but obviously MTTi, something we measure, MTTR, very important, right? So that I think has kind of clear benefits to the business. The less downtime our customers experience in the product, right? The more reliable our systems are, hopefully the more customers we get, things like that. I think there's some, on more of the development side, right? For our internal users, there's a story of, improving productivity overall, letting people work more on the things they want to do, right? Rather than, focusing on troubleshooting for hours a day, work on doing front-end development, back-end development, what have you. So I think that's very important to the business. And, I guess more specific use case at CarGurus, which I think is a little bit different. And maybe not, I don't know. But we've been using observability to try to help our move from monorepo to multi-repo, so to more microservices, right? And I think it hasn't really been talked about today at all, so I think it's a little different, but it's something we've been doing, a lot of, right? Like how can we prove out the faster deployment times, the faster build times, and just kind of tracking that progress, I guess is the best way I can put it. So that's something we've been focusing on really the last year, I want to say, maybe more. And I think that's driven a lot of value to the company.
Thanks for sharing. What are some of the challenges you face? We talked again today about like blockers to adoption and why platforms don't. I'd love to hear like what challenges you face in that journey.
Yeah, we've definitely faced a good amount of challenges. I think there's a few, right? So adoption is definitely one. That's something we've had difficulties with, right? Like you can provide all these great tools and services, doesn't necessarily mean people are going to want to use them, right? Even if you give them a really good pitch, right? It doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. So we've been trying to encourage more trainings, people attending trainings, people learning more about these tools, things of that nature. We've also run into issues with kind of configuration management, I want to say. I think that's a natural challenge for a lot of companies as you scale, right? A lot of times, companies do break up into microservices. And so how do you manage, your OTel SDK configurations? How do you manage your various, whatever configurations, right? And it's not just unique to observability. So that's something we've definitely had a challenge with as we've scaled and grown. And we've dealt it in different ways, but I think it's an ongoing challenge.
Thanks for sharing. Joe, I'll ask you the same question, but I'll ask you from the perspective of your business. Why is observability important to your customers?
Well, from at a real simple level, well, maybe not simple because Matt went into it in real detail, but that is the end result. So I don't think we need to rehash that, but that's like the end result. So that's what you're driving towards. But I think there's another level here too. And from my experience in these multiple scenarios, doing software development and big system design, I like this word system, and I like to view everything as a system. So no matter what you're doing, whether it's a big enterprise or a small application or a big a microservices architecture, something like that, there's lots of things that are happening, and there's lots of people involved. There's manual processes, there's automated processes, there's processes you probably don't even know about. And there's a lot of people that need to be involved to make this decision of what's going on. And I find this across the board in almost every customer that we speak to is they're really lacking this kind of common model of what is the quote unquote system, because everyone has a different perspective of what's going on, right? We're sitting up here and we see a lot of smiling faces. You're sitting back there, you see the backs of people's heads, right? And we all see like the side wall. So we're all looking at a system. If we consider this observability event here as a system, we all have different perspectives. But if we all wanted to talk about this and make informed decisions, we would need one solid model or vision of what is this going on. And I think that's critical to any business because it gives you the ability to everybody come together and make informed decisions on what you should be doing and what could be done.
I love that analogy of looking at it from a different point of view. Like everyone in the room is part of the system, but they see different things. And like, how do you bring that together? So speaking of that, how have you helped the customer on that journey? Like from your point of view, in terms of the service that you provide, like how have you helped the customer really along that journey to help them be successful?
Well, so at our company, we've developed we have a lot of older people that I work with the previous companies that we pulled together from these different areas that we had. And we have processes where we create this model of the system. So we've adapted value streaming, we've modified event storming, we've created our own things like Boris modeling and thin slices where we can very rapidly create a model of a system. And then once we create that model of the system, then we have a way to talk about it. And then we pull in other people like to bring in all those perspectives, right? So like, what does a financial person want to see? What does a developer want to see? Everyone has data, everybody wants to do, where are all those use cases? We build a common model and then kind of go around, what do you want? What do you want? How does that relate to the rest of the model? So it's kind of unique to our practice, but again, it's at that kind of high level of that common canvas that people can talk about.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So now we're talking a little bit about models. We talked a little bit about challenges. David, I'd love to get your perspective here. How are you organized around observability? or the organization of it from the user's point of view?
Yeah, sure. Real quick before we go to that, I want to go back to the previous question, right, about
Great.
troubles we've ran into. I was remembering some other stuff. So we also have had difficulties with cardinality, right? I mean, that's something you guys touched on earlier. It's something we've constantly struggled with, and we haven't had, found a perfect solution for. To be honest, it's a problem, and it definitely can become more challenging as you try to shift ownership over more towards teams, right? The whole like shift left mentality, and that kind of ties into just how we're structured. So to get back to your question now, we're pretty centralized, right? So that was a common theme to talk about today, and we've always been that way, at least since I've been at the company. We have an SRE team, we have observability team that's kind of like a subset of that team, and we really make the majority of the architectural decisions around observability, manage the infrastructure, right? And are kind of consultative in terms of, other engineers coming to us asking for instrumentation help, helping them to really dig deep into the data, telemetry data, and figure out, what's wrong with their services, how they can kind of help themselves in the future. That's kind of our current structure. And as I touched on, a minute ago, we're trying to move a bit more of the ownership to the team. So, rather than us having to kind of go in and really do a lot of this work, right? Like it just doesn't scale super well in our case. At least that's what we're finding. And so, how can we offload some of this stuff to teams to really encourage them to, take action themselves and feel empowered to solve issues their own way, but at the same time, maintaining standards and maintaining best practices and those things.
So curious, since a lot of what he mentioned was around getting to centralize and just getting a little bit more federated, right, to get scale. How have you seen an interaction with a customer where they've sort of evolved from your initial engagement through their own journey?
So we like to, sometimes I go back to some of the challenges that people have in the way the reason like the central model seems to work is what we kind of see is that centralized or a CEO perspective seems to work the best. The challenges that people have is there's tons of data silos, right? Everyone's got their own set of data. The financial people have their data, the operations people have their data, the DevOps people have their data, and everybody wants to pull that together. And the easiest way, or the one that we find the most effective, is to have this centralized COE. And what we like to do with that, or what we've seen customers do with that, is similar to what you're talking about, is you form a centralized team, you bring in a multifaceted team. So you really need to bring in maybe partial members or full-time members from, finance, DevOps, everybody. You need a multifaceted team. And then as that team starts to get more proficient, you start like doing mitosis, breaking off little people into smaller cells. You can recreate this more specifically in their area, say it's finance or DevOps or whatever it is. And that's kind of help customers along their journey, and kind of what we've seen to be the most common pattern. You see doing the same thing. Seems to work very well.
Yeah. And to touch on that, exactly like you're saying, a lot of what we've been doing recently is trying to bring people in temporarily, train them, kind of really help them, and hope that they bring that back as tools to their teams when they kind of go back to their regular positions. And again, really encouraging the training aspect of a lot of this to drive adoption of these tools, right? As well as, just general education.
And what you find is a lot of these things that we're talking about, it's not unique to observability. This is just the way you do software, IT projects, build buildings, whatever it is, right? It's just a common pattern that repeats throughout. So,
Oh, that don't overcomplicate a ham sandwich, right? Like just keep it very simple and make it repeatable. So there's a lot of talk. We talk about the organizational model. There's a lot on the LinkedIn sphere about cloud being so expensive, go to on-prem, et cetera, et cetera. I'm very curious because a lot of this has been driven around cloud native, microservices, right? This whole transformation. David, first off for you, how do you view the journey to cloud as it relates to observability?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting story for us because I think a lot of our efforts to move forward in the observability space are tied to our cloud migration. So a couple of years ago, around the time I started, a little bit before, we'd really put a ton of effort into instrumenting, metrics, traces, stuff of that nature, right, into all of our services, because we wanted to make sure that when we did a migration over to the cloud from on-prem, that it would go as smoothly as possible. We understand when things break, right, because they always break. So That's kind of a lot of how we started and how we justified getting observability off the ground at the company. That's kind of one of the positive sides, right? I think the flip side on that is that there can be a lot of additional complexity when you move into the cloud. I think most people realize that, right? Like it's not going to solve all your problems. One of the complexities obviously is, you have more distributed workloads, right? Like when you have, back in the day, you have one service running on a VM, right? Like it's a little bit easier in some ways to look at logs, look at traces from that, right? When you have, 20 microservices that are all communicating with each other via, queues, some directly via REST, API or HTTP APIs, right? Like that's complicated, and you need different tools sometimes to actually understand that fully. And I think that's sometimes a little bit overlooked, as well as, how do you actually observe some of the cloud services themselves, right? So you have options in AWS, you have options in Google, but it can be tricky.
What do you think was your biggest challenge through that whole journey that you had to overcome, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the challenges is, like I was saying, is trying to figure out how to kind of tie all these different pieces of data together and really select tools, and trying to understand what tool is best for each job, right? So that took a while for us to, how does CloudWatch fit into these things, right? That can be super useful for a lot of the native AWS services, and in our case, we're on AWS, but that may also not be the best choice for having direct instrumentation and services that are not necessarily an AWS service. So I think it just took a lot of research, a lot of time on our part, and just talking to our internal customers and seeing users what they want and what they're interested in.
Thank you. Ask you from the same point of view, from the customer perspective. I'd love to hear sort of how the cloud fits into.
So how the cloud fits in, it's an interesting question, because there's people are different states in their journeys to the cloud. People are moving to the cloud, and other people are born in the cloud. So I think probably the people who are born in the cloud probably have it a little bit easier, because it's not as much of a paradigm shift. You're just kind of immersed in it. People who are migrating to the cloud or moving to the cloud, there's a big mind shift difference, right? You used to control all your resources. Now you're sharing the control of the infrastructure with providers, and you on the other half. Your pricing model used to be you're just paying for hardware. Now you're paying based on consumption. So you have to have that mind shift where you have to know what you're looking for and make sure you're accurately measuring it. So you can't just pick up something that you had running in a data center and move it to the cloud and expect it to be efficient or cost effective. And on the flip side is, if you're in the cloud and you're building a lot of microservices, if you're not paying attention to how you're distributing those microservices, how they're running, you're also running up your bill, or you're not being efficient. So the challenge really is to take a look at what you have, and again, make sure that you're collecting the right kind of data and try to analyze it. And it's not just collecting a lot of data. Sometimes the way we help customers is you can't measure everything because it's very difficult to do. So it goes back to business initiatives, or that big holistic view of your system. What's the most important piece of your system? What is the guts? What makes the stuff happen? And make sure that that's instrumented and you're paying attention to how that's operating and working, so you could modify it and be aware.
Thank you. So this leads us into the next category, which is platform. David, I'll start with you again. You mentioned your AWS user. So what were the most important criteria in the choice of tools, platforms, and partners that you use?
Sure. So I think there's multiple answers to that. One of them, which I think is maybe overlooked sometimes, is business fit, right? And business alignment. I can think of this more in terms of not necessarily AWS, but in terms of other SaaS providers, for telemetry data and observability. We've done a lot of POCs for companies. We've talked to a lot of different vendors and providers. And I think that comes up time and time again. It's does what they're offering align with what we want as a business, right? Because sometimes you get these offerings that cover everything, but it may not necessarily fit with what you're trying to actually do. So I think that's very important. Obviously, things like cost, very important, right? Being competitive in the space with a reasonable cost is definitely something that's critical for us. Maybe less critical for certain companies, but that's an important factor for us. I think what else? There's, relationships with companies, right? I mean, it maybe sounds, I don't know, not as exciting, but I think that's an important factor as well, right? It's establishing a good relationship with a company, making sure, you're on the same page, is very important for us. That's not always a given.
Couldn't agree more with you on that last part. The relationship with the company is vitally important, right? You need to be able to trust people and work with them.
Absolutely.
Joe, what about your point of view?
My point of view is, let's see. So I think you have to make sure that the tools that you use and the platforms that you're selecting do what you want them to do, right? So like I'll take the analogy when you go to a hardware store and you buy a drill, you don't want a 1/2-inch drill, you want a 1/2-inch hole, right? So what are you trying to do? And as you're saying, how does that fit? What does that tool fit to the business purpose that you're trying to do? And then once you get the right tool, then you can go into, is it cost effective? And does it have a good support network is really good. Another thing I think that I want to bring up too is how fast is it evolving, right? So the tool is good today. That's a good drill. It drills really good, but tomorrow there's going to be different types of holes you need to make. So is that company building the right drills that are going to go through whatever you need to drill a hole? And I'm kind of making this up, but the analogy is probably a little too long. But you need a company that's actually moving forward and releasing software and developing features at a reasonable pace that you can adopt and use. And then also, does it have an ecosystem where it integrates with a lot of things, right? So as we are a consulting company, we come into companies who've been through their homegrown processes, 6 or 7 other vendors are in there making things, is generally a mishmash of stuff. So if you want a tool and we want to deliver value fast, what we're looking for is something that we can pull in a lot of other integrations with very rapidly and not have to learn a lot of things. So training and knowledge is very fast too, because sometimes we recommend tools, but customers say, we want you to use this one. If they make me use one, I would prefer to have one that has a bunch of building blocks, things I could use out of the box and get me ramped up very quickly, as opposed to having to, figure everything out on my own.
Yeah, integrations is a great call out. That's something we definitely look forward to. And I think really minimizing the impact on other parts of the business, right? We don't want to ask every developer, every engineer to put in a ton of effort for something that we want to move to or migrate to, right? Or adopt. So yeah, integrations, definitely key, minimizing the amount of work for the rest of the company. And we do lean towards it, for the most part, I think more open source tooling as well. So, OpenTelemetry, very important for us. We use it pretty heavily. Some Fluentd, FluentBit, those types of tools as well are, I think, pretty important.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about your experiences and what you've done to date, which I hope everyone finds super helpful, right? To just share your experience, share the tooling, how you're doing it. I want to focus a little bit around like what's next. So you got into a level of maturity. David, again, I'll start with you. What are the next developments in your vision observability? Like what's around the corner for you that you want to start thinking about, and why?
Yeah, so there's definitely still gaps here, things we want to improve on in our observability story. One of them is, I'd say, front-end observability is something we've kind of neglected, honestly, a little bit. Most of our focus has been traditionally on the back-end side of observability. So I think trying to, put in a good, some solid tooling there, a good story around the front end that, is equal to or on par with the back end that we have today, I think is pretty important and definitely a direction we want to go in. There's also the tool consolidation. I mean, we talked about that, or you guys talked about that in some of the earlier sessions, is that we've consolidated it slightly over the years, but I think there's still too many tools. I think we need to get to a place where there's maybe not a single pane of glass, but at least a few pane of glass, a few windows, right? So that's something that we're still striving towards, and it's going to be, I think, a long-term goal, but it's something we do want to keep moving towards as much as possible.
Joe, I'll ask you the same question, but from your point of view, you deal with a lot of customers, right? Where David deals with one notionally concern day to day. How about you? Like, what do you see from your customers in terms of like what's around the corner?
What's around the corner? Akwi and I even mentioned AI in this conversation we've had in like the last how many minutes, right?
Only the second time we said it all day, right?
Right.
That's pretty good.
I think I want to use your term because I like that. It says I want to rub some AI on it, right? Normally what we say, our customers want to buy AIs, and we say, well, how many AIs do you want, right? That's kind of the joke. But
the AI SKU, right?
The AI SKU, exactly. But there's a lot that it can't do, and there's a lot that it can do. And I think there's huge potential here. Because as you said, like observability tends to lean more towards infrastructure, back-end stuff, not so much as to how the product is, how the customer's using it. And I think AI could help a lot in that way by being able to just look for patterns, how things are used, how the back end is running with the front end, and try to use that information to be, as Matt was saying, way more proactive, right? So the thing is most of the world in this space here tends to be very reactive. Something happens, I don't want it to happen again. But really going a little further, being proactive as to like, how can I make my product better? Like, how can I make this faster, quicker? What features are customers using? That kind of stuff is all possible, right? And I think that's where, if I was to say where I want it to go, I'd want it to be pushed more down towards customer interaction versus how the system is being used on the backside.
Yeah, the AI is a great point. I am shocked how few times it's come up so far. Honestly, I thought it'd be talked about more. But yeah, I think in our case it'd be a little bit different. But using some of the new AI tools to really get to root cause faster, for instance, right, is definitely something we want to investigate. So less from the external customer side maybe, but more from let's improve productivity even more by just narrowing down on the abnormalities, if you want to say, right, in an incident, and really figuring out what's wrong and what's anomalous there.
Or higher levels of automation too. So AI is really good at, we like to say, to remove human drudgery. If you're doing it once, you should fix it. You could write scripts and templates, but you could also build smart things that know how to do certain configurations. And if everything is as code, it's viable to say, I want this, go do it for me, as opposed to having an engineer run a bunch of scripts or do whatever. So there's a lot of potential there as well.
Yeah, and there's been some asks definitely on the development side to kind of enable tools that help them use AI and LMs to kind of pull from some of the different observability tools we use, which is kind of an interesting idea and something we're trying to think of how we can work with them to incorporate that into their development workflow and debugging practices.
Thank you. Joe, so how do you anticipate observability will impact businesses as it continues to mature?
How it impact businesses? I think it's just going to help them make. How's it going to impact? It's going to make them better, right? It's going to help them make more money, reduce costs, and be more efficient. It's now as you move towards being more proactive, which seems to be the trend. That is going to be a huge windfall for businesses. Right now, I think a lot of businesses are going based on how the customers are using their applications, but maybe there's a more impact there from being more predictive. So it's definitely something you got to get on board with. It's the ability not to react, but to predict and be proactive into kinds of features, use cases, and all that stuff. I think supports with just as much as data you can have, and again, making sure that it's all consolidated data. The biggest thing I see again is that there's all these silos of information and people don't pull that together. So as more of these applications progress and you start pulling in all the different aspects of the finance, DevOps, product, and everything together, I think that's just going to make things move faster and quicker. And companies are going to run more efficiently and make more money.
Awesome. David, from your perspective, how do you see that impacting businesses as it continues to mature, or your business?
Yeah. Actually, something you just touched on, I think is going to be important to us too, is the FinOps side, right? It's something in the cost attribution is something we're starting to look into more, not necessarily just on my team, but other teams as well, right? Across the company. I think that's going to be a very important part of observability. I mean, it's already kind of grown over the last few years, and I think that's going to continue to grow. Similar like you're saying too, I think kind of pulling these different pieces of data together. I know that's been talked about today a lot as well. And I think that's going to be more of the future and really make a good business case for adopting more modern observability tools as well. So I think that's the main selling points for businesses I can think of.
Awesome. All right, I got one more question for each of the panelists, then we'll hand it over to the room. Molly, what's our time check? Okay. Okay, great. I think we'll do a little bit of Q&A with the room as well. Would you like that? Would you like to ask some questions for the panel? Yes?
Absolutely.
All right, there you go. Somebody's excited.
But that's a Grafana plan.
I like that. I like that. So Matt, you can't ask, you have all the answers, so you can't ask the questions. So I'm going to do one more for each of you. David, I'll start with you. If you have one recommendation for people in the room embarking on an observability strategy overhaul, what would it be?
Yeah, I think talking to stakeholders is critical. Building requirements as well, right? That's something we've learned, I think, over the years, the hard way. And trying to get that done up front saves you a lot of time down the road. Is just fully understanding, like, what do you want? What do your stakeholders want? How can you find a way to get there and meet in the middle, right? I think that's very important. I also think standardization as early as possible is a big win. It's something that, was hard for us. I think it's hard for a lot of companies, especially if you've been around for a long time and things kind of organically grow every which way. But if you're starting off kind of from scratch, definitely as much as possible, try to come up with the same set of standards that people can use. Obviously, they'll change and shift over time, but at least you can start with hopefully a solid base and grow from there.
One recommendation. Okay, so this is a multifaceted one recommendation, but it's kind of like treat it. I come from the software side more of the world. That's where most of my career has been. So there's the way people run projects there, or that whole agile mentality, lean mentality of involving the user like you were talking about, and really treating it not like a technology driven thing, but as an outcome driven project or engagement, and having a prioritized list of things you want to do first, identifying the business outcome that you want, a real outcome, not a technology outcome. How are you going to measure that? Who are the core users of the system? What do they want? And run it like that, to me, is like, that's the one recommendation I have. I see a lot of technology being implemented for technology's sake, as opposed to running this kind of holistic view. If you're writing software and you're good at writing software, you would say, well, who's using my software and why would they buy it? You got to take the same mentality on observability. Who's going to use my software and who would pay money to give them the information that I'm doing? So I think that's the thing I would suggest.
Terrific. All right. First off, big round of applause to our panelists. You want to open it up? What's that?
If anyone has a question, I'll
Yep.
run a mic to you. Anyone other than that? Yeah. Here we go.
Dave, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about you mentioned some struggles with cardinality. If you could just say some more words about that.
Yeah, just in general. Sure. So we use Prometheus internally, right, for a time series database. And as I think most people have used Prometheus know, it struggles a lot with cardinality. It's a kind of a known issue with Prometheus. So we've had, many problems over the years. I can think of several examples, and this is probably the most common one, where we'll have a service, right, and they want, some time series data, right? They want a dimension that's on, the URI, right? They want to see like, the unique paths, for whoever's hitting my endpoints, right? It's a reasonable request. The problem is that, a lot of times you have unique identifiers or almost unique identifiers basically buried in there, and that quickly explodes. So we've had cases where I'm pretty sure I've seen one service, a single pod, have like close to 1 million time series, which is insane. So, trying to communicate that to developers and engineers can be a little bit challenging, because a lot of times, they don't understand the problem, and they also don't understand like, it's a reasonable ask, right? Like, why can't I do that? And it's hard to say, technically, it puts a lot of strain on the system and memory database, all that stuff. But that's something we've run into a lot. And that kind of comes up over and over again. And we've dealt with it in different ways. We have limits on the number of, samples that in time series that will be, pulled from services. And if they go over that, we trigger an alert and basically stop, pulling metrics from their service. That has its own problems, right? But there are different ways to deal with it. It's just none of them are ideal.
Hi, I'm Shafina. So we were discussing about the observability throughout the session, right? But what your opinion about the governance of all these proactive monitoring tools? Because we are coming from operations team, and at one point we will be like heavily depending on these alerts coming from all these monitoring tools, and one day we find like, okay, there are alerts missing, or there is some performance issues with these monitoring tools. So it's high time we need to think about the governance around all these monitoring tools, right? So just want to know the opinion around it.
Just say one is like an approach of how you implement governance, right? And again, I'm going to go back to my software analogy, because that's the one that I'm most comfortable with. When you build software, you do a lot of testing, right? It's a lot of test-driven development or validating what's going on. As you're implementing your governance, like, test it, right? There should be ways where you could say that things aren't happening, or they should be happening, and your system is capturing things that aren't missing. So that's like kind of like the main point. It's kind of like conceptually is do that, right? But then figure out is figure out is what is it actually that you need to track or that you need to govern, and make sure how you're going to enforce that, and then be able to test that before it gets there, right? You want to, again, move towards being proactive as opposed to being reactive.
Yeah. I mean, just to build off that, like we have tons and tons and tons of dashboards and different tools to monitor our observability stack. I mean, that's something we constantly have to look at. In terms of, I don't know if you're touching on this, but in terms of like ownership, right? Like we're a centralized model, so it's really owned by me and a few other teammates. So if something does break, or we get alerts on, Fluent D is having issues, right? Like it's on us to go in and fix that and maintain that. And almost every time we'll catch it before anyone else notices, which is the way it should be. And we do have alerts and SLOs, SLIs that are, more on the proactive side, right? To try to catch these things before anyone would run into problems. But yeah, it's a challenge we have. But it has, it's worked well enough for us over the years, I'll say. It's not ideal, but it works.
Give a perspective on this one. So you mentioned, what alerts do I react to? Why? How? Governance has a few different angles, right? One is the right people accessing the right data, right? So there's a governance there. But then there's also like, what are you actually measuring and tracking and reacting to? And that's where, David, you were talking about, like the shift to discrete from discrete individual alerts of components to things like SLIs and SLOs, right? Things that actually measure the experience that I can actually get in front of and react before the customer cares about. That's part of the evolution. And we talked a little bit earlier about the observability strategy. That's where you need your stakeholders, right? That's where you need to actually understand how these systems are being used, how they're being measured, and creating those contracts in your observability system. It's a journey, right? It's not going to just be about alert duplication or event management, right? Like the one thing I always say is you have to create better alerts, and that starts by actually understanding the user experience, understanding the contract.
Yeah, and that's something that's, you can have very different use cases for the same system, right? So to build off your point, like we've had this kind of, it's been somewhat of an issue for us, is that in some cases, developers are using their logs as just like a debugging tool, right? They just submit some stuff, they want to see it show up somewhere, and then be like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe something broke. I need to see a line here that say why it broke. And then on the other side of that, we have teams that are using our log pipelines as more of like analytics pipelines, right? And so their use case is very different, and their tolerance for data loss is also very different. So to your point, it's very important to understand that, because what may not matter to one person may very much matter to another person, even though they're, again, technically just logs of the same system.
Hi, I'm Dave Lovelock. I work with a lot of performance of large on-prem applications in hospitals around the world. And so what do you think is the best way to take all of this information that we're gathering in an observability platform and turn it into actionable items, things that will actually tell somebody, take this action, when the on-prem environment often doesn't have a lot of skills in data analysis or such things?
First, you got to start by asking, what do you want to do, right? It goes back to the objective. I'm calculating all this data. Do you want to save money? Do you want to retire old hardware? Do you want to increase the performance of something? So you've got to start with what is the objective that you want first in your on-prem environment, and then figure out how you can measure it.
I was thinking more about the long-term strategy, but at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon,
In a moment.
the performance suddenly goes from 1 second to 1.5 seconds.
Okay.
Yeah, I can touch on that. I think, at least in my opinion, the most useful of like the 3 pillars in that case is traces. I mean, that's something we go to pretty much immediately for any incident. Is we'll jump in and we'll look at, in our case, we currently use Honeycomb, right, for tracing. And we'll jump in and say, okay, like, and we have dashboards that visualize a lot of this, but we'll see, what broke, where it broke, in the system. You can see, if there's a call chain that's like across 5 or 6 different services, right? You can see all of that visualized there. You can see a lot of times, where the error was, and also a lot of times the stack trace, depending on, how it's instrumented, right? But we're fortunate enough that in our case, we're pretty Java heavy. In Java, you get the OpenSymmetry tracing agent, which is like auto-instrumented for a lot of different frameworks. So it's pretty easy to get up and running there. Again, assuming you have some way to do the analysis, and that's kind of the key point, right? Like we have Honeycomb, which makes it easy. We did also use Jaeger, which is like open source, right? So if you want to deploy that and manage it yourself, we did that for a while, and it might be good enough for your use case to find problems and kind of fix things as fast as possible.
Actions when the people on site are not very skilled.
I don't know, hire more skilled people.
Training and enablement, right?
ChatGPT.
What was that, Matt?
ChatGPT. Write better run books.
Do you know if it's this, have you resolved these issues? Has it been similar things multiple times over? Or is it always something new and random when you have these failures? Well, code changes, I mean, is somebody testing it before it got in there? I mean, this is like go back to the software development process as well, right? It's like you should do as much not to put any failures into the system before you get to the system. Right.
Yeah, yeah. And the run book is a good call out. If it's a common issue, we do that. Like we have run books all over the place. So if it's something that comes up frequently enough, we'll just create a run book for it and make it pretty clear that like, this is what you do if the solar fires. You'll literally put a link to the documentation, or even if there's some automation, have it trigger automatically. So if it's common, you can do something like that.
We have time for one more? I see. Oh, all right. We'll do two more. Go fast.
So I'm Satish. So in line with all these questions that has been asked, so I know this is more of observability, dashboard, alerting, and all that stuff. So are we looking at what's next? Like, so can we get into self-healing? Is there any development, or I know it's altogether a different requirement as such, but are we thinking in that direction? So I know there are, if we have to buy in too many tools. Right now we have for monitoring, we have plenty of tools, and for fixing them, if we have to get into another set of tools, so it's expensive. So can we look at how we can, I know you already have huge telemetry of the infrastructure data. So can we get into that? Like, is there any plans for that? Like, so what are we thinking about that? Okay.
Yeah, is that a Grafana roadmap question? I don't know.
I can give you an operational piece of it. So we talked a little bit earlier about the journey, right? And how do you implement a successful observability strategy? And there was a key part around the culture, which is automating the things that are repetitive. And so when I think of your question, it's twofold, right? So self-healing is like, okay, what are all the patterns? Tell me what the problem is and go fix it for me. Great. The other piece of really driving observability success is taking the low-hanging fruit and automating that. And that's something we do today in Grafana. It's not quote unquote self-healing, but it's your ability to react to an alert or an activity and go and say, go do something with this. The example I always give, because this is my brain, it works very simple. You have a Windows server that Windows temp it fills up to 99%. You don't need somebody to log into the Windows server to go clear out temp, right? Write a playbook, write an automation script, write something, allow the alert to go and trigger that and go remediate it. So every time that alert triggers, you now have an automated response. Build a run book around it. There's a bit of secret sauce around it, but like the real secret sauce is around taking the things that are just common, documenting and making those repeatable and automatable. So you take that toil completely off of your book of work. Like that's a real part of making observability successful, is that you're able to show the value chain throughout the entire thing that happens, and Grafana does give you the tools to do that, right? But it becomes part of like, is this really important? Should I invest the time? Because what you don't want to have happen is you don't want to have Grafana or any other system to go and say, oh, go auto heal it, and all of a sudden you take down an entire Kubernetes cluster, right? And then what do you do? You're calling the vendor and put a support ticket in, but you're you're out. Matt, I know you have a view here. That's right.
End-to-end testing is so important, not just in pre-prod, but also in production. That's where you learn those lessons where you mentioned an example like disk space filling up. That happens all the time. Or out of memory conditions that arrives because your JVM is starved. Maybe it's memory, but catching those proactively and then coming up with these run books to know your background and share, right? So it makes sense. We can then automate remediation of that. Something I've actually done in other observability as well, which is we have the context. Then you take action. Maybe difficult to solve or maybe not to, but you understand what when those issues arise, how do you deal with it? So testing is critical, both pre and post. And load testing is where you see the, excuse the phrase, the shit. Right? But yes, you stress testing enough, you're going to find the weaknesses, and they'll tell you when you need to spend time.
One more.
Yeah, there's one back here.
Thank you. So obviously it's easy, air quotes, to implement observability within a system that you're writing yourself, specifically referencing the topic that's come up several times today of observability as code. However, there are systems that are moderately or heavily dependent upon third-party systems APIs that you have limited control over how much insight you can glean from their systems. What are some tips, tricks, strategies you've adopted in those cases to enhance your observability into those systems to the best, the best of your own ability?
I can quickly talk on it. I mean, I think that does come up sometimes for us, right? It's a challenge. You know, if you can't control the third party and what they instrument, right? That's a problem. My general recommendation has typically been to try to create kind of like a boundary or box around those separate APIs, right? That you're externally accessing for the third party, and try to make sure like that boundary, right? That code boundary is very well instrumented in terms of metrics, right? So for us, that can be, you know, we have the auto instrumentation on the tracing side, but that might be more metrics, you know, around the specific function calls that call those external APIs, and just trying to really make sure you can see as much as possible in that one specific area of your code. That's kind of the best advice I can think of, at least. You know, there's only so much you can do if you don't have a lot of insight into what the third party's doing.
Yeah, and we've done similar things. We try to kind of, if it's a third-party API, you could try to probe it a bunch of ways and write your own kind of little service that is actively monitoring it in more ways than what you can get from a log or something like that. So you don't have limited control, but you can write software yourself and you can exercise stuff. So if you have an external system, you can kind of probe it and play with it and just kind of write your own little agents. That's a bad word too, right? Agents, that we're talking about AI. So little agents that are out there trying to collect as much information as possible for you.
Yeah, that is something we've done a few times. I'm not necessarily proud to say it, but yeah, like kind of just probes to see if something's still alive, and you know, if they say they're alive. Yeah, that is something you can do too. I mean, I think going back to what I was saying before, I think in some cases we've just created very sensitive alerts around those areas in the code, right? And just really, if we know their uptime is 99.9%, right? Like if there's any failures, immediately fire an alert, because we know it's going to lead to a cascade of failures essentially in the system. Yeah.
Thank you.